evening everyone, and welcome to our Generational Divide panel event, which is part of the Economic and Social Research Council's Festival of Social Science Week. I'd like to start by thanking you all for coming here today. We want this event to be very interactive, and there'll be plenty of opportunities later for you to ask us questions, share your experiences, tell us what you think about intergenerational relationships and differences. And you'll be able to do this in the traditional way by hands up and asking questions here in this room. Or if you like to be more innovative and technological, you can log on to the website there, the genderdivide18.socialqa.com, and you can submit a question online. I see Trevor's kind of putting his head in his hands at the new technology. So you can use the online question service. I'll get the question coming up here on laptop. It enables people to ask questions anonymously and if they feel nervous about putting their hand up. So I think it's good to have lots of different opportunities and ways to engage. And we're also being live streamed. So hello to anybody who's watching us live out there at the moment, being live streamed through the University of Birmingham's Facebook page. So again, anybody who's not here in the room who would like to engage online and ask us a question, I've got the laptop there, so we'll look at your questions and we can put those to the panel. So, and again, for everybody in the room, we are being live streamed. So, and we'd also like to encourage you to tweet if you are so minded. So the hashtag I think is up there, GenDivide18. So use that Twitter hashtag, and we can debate those that are here, those that are not here. We can all take part in this discussion. So I'm Karen Rowlingson. I'm Professor of Social Policy at the University of Birmingham, and I've written about economic inequality, both between generations, but also, and crucially for my research, within generations. I'll ask our panel to introduce themselves very briefly in a moment, and then we'll start the conversation by I'll ask them a few questions to follow up on the things they've said, and then it'll be over to you to join in the discussion further. Before I do that, I just want to say a few words about why we're here. Over the past 30 years or so, the world has changed quite rapidly. And today's younger generation are in a very different position to the position I was in, for example, 30 years ago, people in my generation. One example of this, of course, is higher education. In my day, 30 years ago, I went to university and not only didn't have to pay any tuition fees, we didn't even know what tuition fees were, the concept hardly existed. I got a full maintenance grant. So I came out of university with not a single penny of debt, and I didn't have to ask my parents to make any kind of financial contribution to that education. Things have certainly changed. We also see today many challenges that young people are facing in relation to housing, the private rented sector, lack of access to social renting, difficulty in buying a property, again, unless you've got access to the bank of mum and dad. And the labour market has changed too, with 0 hours contracts, the gig economy, and things are tough for younger people. I think we'd all agree on that. On the other hand, there have been other changes which perhaps are more exciting, more opportunities for younger people in relation to how society functions, with new technology, the internet, smartphones, social media. We also see other changes like the growth in the beauty industry, the growth in youth entrepreneurship. There are lots of opportunities here, but also potential threats. So should we see these changes as great opportunities, exciting, that face us all, or should we see some challenges here? And to what extent do these create divides between generations? That's the particular focus of today's event. We want to discuss all these issues and many others that you would like to raise. And we want to hear about your experiences too, and give you a chance to quiz our experts about some of these issues. So let's turn to our panel, and I'm going to ask each panellist just to take a minute to introduce themselves, say a little bit about their organisation, if they've come from outside of the university. We have some people from outside the University of Birmingham as well as some academics, and what their perspective is on the issue. So I'd like to start by asking first Kieran Trehan, Professor of Leadership and Enterprise Development at University of Birmingham's Department of Management, to introduce herself. Kieran.
Great, thank you. So I'm Kieran Trehan, and what am I interested in? I'm interested in small firms. I'm interested in entrepreneurial mindsets, but most of all, I'm interested in inclusive leadership. So what does leadership of the future look like? What are the differences between generations? And what does inclusive leadership mean in business and in civil society?
Great, thank you. That was much less than a minute, Kieran, but that's fine. We'll come back and ask further questions and engage you more, but thank you very much. Turning now to Neil. We're delighted to have Neil Duncan Jordan from the National Pensioners Convention. So Neil, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Karen.
The
National Pensioners Convention is Britain's biggest campaigning organisation for older people. It's not a charity, it's a pressure group set up in the late 70s by Jack Jones, the former Transport and General Workers Union leader, with very strong and long-standing connections to the trade union movement. Our view is that if you need representation when you're at work, you certainly need it when you retire. So we're a campaigning organisation. On this particular issue, we think the debate's been framed incorrectly, in the sense that too often people are defined by the generation into which they were born, and the assumption is made, wrongly, that everybody within such a generation has shared the same life experiences, same wealth outcomes, same health outcomes, and so on. We think that skews the debate unfairly, and it needs to be recast. Not only that, we think that the inequalities, as Karen quite rightly said, the inequalities that we have in society are much greater inside generations than they are necessarily between generations. And our fear, and I'll finish on this, is that we are now experiencing a phony war between the ages, constructed by those who want to roll back the welfare state for ideological reasons. So we must resist that, because at the end of the day we believe that the generations have a much closer shared agenda on issues like housing, social care, retirement ages than our opponents would have us believe.
Thanks very much, Neil. We'll certainly come back to those points and have a good discussion on that, I'm sure. So next we have Amanda Chetwynd-Cowison, who's joining us. She's the new chair of the British Youth Council to represent the voices of young people. So delighted to have you here, Amanda, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you. So hello, thank you very much everyone for having me. As I said, I'm Amanda and I'm the really quite new chair, about a couple of weeks in. But I've been involved with the British Youth Council for about a year now on their trustee board. And for anybody who's not sure, British Youth Council, or BYC, is the representational body for young people. The young people who are involved in our programmes get involved at the age of 25 or under. It goes kind of all the way down. We do a mixture of like traditional programmes. So we run the Youth Parliament, which has representatives from a lot of the different constituencies. We run a youth select committee that runs exactly like a traditional select committee, but everybody on it is a young person, and they still tackle quite big subjects like traditional committees. And what I've kind of decided to talk a little bit about today was votes at 16, because I always think that's a really interesting debate where you have people constantly saying in the media and the press and wider society saying that young people don't want to be involved in democracy and they're not interesting. And yet the Votes at 16 campaign is 18 years old and has been voted annually to be the campaign for the British Youth Council for 17 of those years. And this is one of the first years that actually the young people voted for a different primary campaign. So I'll be focusing a little bit on that this evening.
Fantastic, thank you. And the last of our external guests, external to the university, we have Laura Gardner from the Resolution Foundation, the award-winning think tank, I think it is, who will provide more of a research focus to today's conversation. So Laura, would you like to say a little bit about the Resolution Foundation and your work?
Sure. So the Resolution Foundation is a think tank that focuses on living standards for people on low and middle incomes. And as well as our traditional focus on differences across the income distribution, over the last couple of years we've been focusing on differences between different generations in society. In particular, we ran an intergenerational commission where we got the head of the Trade Union Congress, business leaders, academics, journalists, together to run a 2-year project looking at the evidence for living standards differences between generations and what policy solutions might be needed to tackle it. And so I'll be drawing on that evidence today. We published 20 or so working papers and this sort of rather chunky final report, which has, I think, 76 charts and 38 policy recommendations in it. So I'll have plenty to talk about in terms of some of those core aspects of living standards and the generational differences in those.
Great, thank you very much. Next we have Heather Widdows, a Professor of Global Ethics in the University of Birmingham's Department of Philosophy. Heather, would you like to introduce yourself?
Certainly, and I'd like to thank you all for coming out on a dark and stormy night to talk to us about this. It's a real pleasure to be here. My most recent work is about the rising demands of beauty, rising on different types of women, rising across the age range. There's less generational divide than one might think, and a global rise, and also a rise that's extending to men too. So there are generational differences, but they're very much not about an increased demand or increased pressures, but more about the different kinds of things. So just, to give a couple of examples, what you have to do in terms of hair removal might change slightly at different ages, but the rise in general is everybody has to do more than they used to do. And of course there are issues about what you do if you're in selfie culture compared to if you're not. But in general the demands are rising. Now the role of the beauty industry, which I was asked to speak about tonight, this is complex because it both drives demand and it also responds to demand. So my favourite example right now is large pores. So if you walk down a beauty aisle in Boots or any shop, you will see lines and aisles of creams that are addressing skin problems. Now, they often come in threes: wrinkles, dark spots, and large pores. Now, so there's a real sense that the beauty industry creates things that we then see as problems that we then have to fix them. So I'm very certain that my mother did not know that large pores were a problem when she was 18. I did not, but I'm pretty sure my 11-year-old daughter will. So there is a driving element of the beauty industry. But we can only be sold products to address our large pores if we've already bought into the view that smooth, luminous and perfect skin, perfect in a way that's quite inhuman, is something we desire.
So yeah, large pores to me, I think about cats and dogs really rather than skin, but yeah, I
you need
I know
to go to
where you
Boots, Karen.
yeah. And last but not least, we have David Horton, Senior Lecturer in Marketing from Birmingham Business School. David.
Thank you. Yes, so thank you all for coming. I started off my research career largely driven by an interest in technology I've had since I was very, very young. But while I was very, very young, my interest in technology came from my parents and my grandparents. So I've never really bought into the generational divide in technology. Simultaneously, though, I have to acknowledge that there are some factors that are at play here that go beyond my want to split that generational divide. And so I really try and look at this as an investigation of what does the technology do for us, and how does it cause any behaviours or change our behaviour or work with us, and then how do we work and change the technology to fit our needs around us. So I will be bringing to the table a bit of a story about how people form relationships and use technology to form relationships, and also some of the more severe consequences of using these technologies.
Okay, thanks. So we've got a very eclectic mix on our panel of academics, people from outside organisations, pressure groups, research think tanks, covering a very wide range of topics, and there might be also bring into this conversation. So please, again, do submit questions at any point. You can submit questions now online and I'll pick them up when I go and sit down later. Also, just something I need to mention before we get to the end, because we always forget when we get to the end, is we do have a feedback sheet for this event, so please do fill that in before you leave us when this session's over. So before we hand over to you in the audience here and look at your questions online, I'm just going to use my privilege as chair to probe a little bit further each of the panellists on some of the things they've said and try and get this debate going. So I think I'm going to start with Laura, if that's okay. And to respond perhaps to Neil's point, is this a kind of phony war between the generations? Is the generational divide a real thing? We've posed it as a possible real thing. Is it real? Is it just a media invention to obscure other forms of inequalities? What's your take on this?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that we sort of reject the notions of war or divide. And one of the reasons why we do that is lots of our research is based on analysis of economic data sets, but we didn't actually start there. We started by doing some polling of the public and said, what do you think about this issue? So first we said, we asked some questions to get at, do you think that there is a generational contract that underpins society? So do you think we should support people when they're in old age as a society? People across age groups said yes, of course. do you think that each generation in society should do better than the one before in terms of their living standards? People said yes. And then across age groups as well. And then we said, do you think today's young adults are set to do better in terms of living standards than their parents? And by a factor of 2 to 1, people said, no, we don't. So that was our starting point, that the public thinks that generational progress should be something that happens in society, but it doesn't think it's happening for today's young people. And then just to engage with the other point you made around kind of, is there more difference within generations than between them? Yes, there is, and there has always been. And obviously, to do economic research, you do have to categorise people in ways that hide a multitude of divergences within groups. When we talk about the gender pay gap, we know that the 50% of society that are women have quite a range of experiences compared to the men. But nonetheless, those two categories are useful for analysis in the same way that chunking people up into age groups is. So we've always had massive differences within generations, and we still do. And nothing we do about the emerging differences between generations should exacerbate those within generation problems. Indeed, the reason why we're focusing on these intergenerational differences is because we think if left untrammeled, they'll drive wider social inequalities in future via the inheritance of wealth from well-off baby boomer parents to largely advantaged young people. So that's just to kind of engage with some of the points you asked me in terms of, is this all a load of rubbish or not? But yeah, just sort of, so a minute on what we found. So we started by asking the public, do you think each generation should do better than the last? Yes. Do you think young people are going to? No. What are your main concerns? They said jobs, houses and pensions. So that's what we went out to look at. And the bottom line is the public were roughly right. So in jobs, although youth unemployment's been much less of a problem in recent decades, today's young adults are earning no more than those born 15 years before them at the same age. And that's an absolutely catastrophic break with the progress we became used to in the 20th century. And that's because they're likely to be in lower skilled occupations, insecure self-employment, more likely to be on 0 hours contracts. And they're even also moving jobs much less frequently, which is how you get those big pay rises that help your career to progress. Housing, it's really well known. Millennials, I'm going to use the labels, which often spark kind of ignite frustrations and stuff. Millennials are half as likely to own their homes at 30 as baby boomers were. They're also more likely to be commuting further and they have less space. Housing is a massive generational catastrophe. Pensions, we've got more people saving because of auto-enrolment, but rather than the defined benefit schemes of yesterday, we're now saving into defined contribution schemes, and they're far more risky in terms of your investment returns and how you're protected against your own longevity. So these different areas, housing, jobs and pensions, they might have different drivers, but they are all coming together to put pressures on today's young adults. And when we think about our ageing population and the cost of the welfare state, as the baby boomers move into old age, if we go to the usual routes of taxing income or consumption more, we're just going to be taking more out of the pockets of those people that are having the toughest time at the moment. So I'll finish talking in a sec. So the policy solutions that the Intergenerational Commission came up with were about, first, how do we fund the welfare state that today's older generation will rely on and should have, as the public said it's their right to have, but how do we do that in a generationally fair way? And that means looking at wealth taxation to harness more of the assets of well-off members of older generations. How do we get progression moving in the labour market again and add a bit more security? How do we increase housing supply and use things like the tax system to rebalance housing demand to get more homes for ownership available to young people while also making the private rented sector less insecure? And how do we reduce the risks in the new pension system while celebrating the success we've had in getting more people saving at least? So sort of to wrap up everything I've just said, it's not a war. Our research started from what the public feels about generations, and there is this belief in a concept of generational solidarity and progress in living standards through the generations. We don't see that progress happening on the core aspects of living standards, jobs, houses and pensions, despite all the myriad things that are better. And we think there's a strong case for policy intervention to tackle some of those living standards challenges.
Thanks. So, yeah, coming back to Neil, really, it does seem that the baby boomers, that generation born between about 45, 65, I don't know if there are any baby boomers in the room. Okay, so we'll come to. So I think there are some people born between 1945 and 65. Let's put it that way then, very neutral with no labels. Okay, so we can have a debate about some of these labels if we like, but that generation then who are born are, if we look at the stats, a very wealthy generation on many accounts in terms of housing wealth. Many have, a significant proportion have more than one home, have large homes and so on, compared to younger generations who probably are not going to get to that position for various reasons. Is there something here? Is there a reason why people are concerned that is reasonable? Or, again, do you think this is a phony war, as you put it?
I mean, I think it is a phony war, of course. I mean, there are lots of explanations for some of the things that have been said. For example, the fact that you bought your house in the 50s when nobody wanted to live in a particular part of London, and you stayed there all that time, and you didn't really do very much to it, but you just maintained it. And now it happens to be in Notting Hill and it's worth loads of money. It's not really your fault. And I think there has to be some understanding of that. There is a suggestion that people have done that on purpose. And I think we have to roll back that argument. People haven't done those things on purpose. When you look at the generation that are retired now, not just baby boomers, the people who are retired now, in the 1980s, unemployment was in double figures. They lived through that when they were workers. Inflation was almost 20%. 10 years later, that happened again. So we can talk about how austerity has affected younger people, and we would accept all the things that you said earlier, Karen, about zero-hour contracts and all of those things about housing. But older people who've managed to get this far have also experienced those things at least twice during their lifetime. In fact, when I was looking at interest rates, compared what I pay on my mortgage to the 18% that people were paying in the 80s, it's unthinkable now. So this idea that it's always been rosy in the past and now it's really hard, actually that isn't true. It was really hard as well for other people. Factually, half of all pensioners have got an income less than 12 grand a year. They don't pay income tax. Yes, they might own a house. I accept that because they bought it, at a time when that's what people did, and they were able to do that. And so they're sitting on a lot of money, but they haven't got a lot of cash. Not having more than 12 grand a year. I mean, come on. To argue that entire cohort, we're talking about 5 to 6 million people, okay, are really well off and somehow have got to be punished. I mean, that just isn't the way to look at these sort of things. And let's look at some of the issues that were raised about the employment situation now for young people. Pensioners aren't responsible for zero-hour contracts. They're not responsible for the gig economy. They're not responsible for the failure of Carillion. They're not responsible for tuition fees. They're not responsible for high rents. Some of the problems that younger people face in the employment situation is because the trade union movement has lost its strength. The fact that trade unions can't hold on to final salary pension schemes, which they secured, firstly for male members and then extended it to female workers as well in the 70s and beyond, they can't hold that line now. They've been weakened from all sorts of legislation reasons and other political reasons as well, which we're not necessarily here to talk about. But to level that, because some generation fought hard to get a better pension and you're not perhaps prepared to make the same sacrifices and fight now, I think that's really unfair to pitch those two against each other.
Okay. Karen, sorry, you wanted to come in there.
I think the points that sort of both the panelists made are really important ones. And so I wonder about this question about polarised positions, because in some ways it's easier, to do that. And I think it's much, much more complex than that, and I think we have to take a more holistic approach. So I really like this notion of workplace inclusivity, diversity. It's not just about workplaces, it's not just about housing, it's not just about social care. Actually, it's how those things intertwine and have a knock-on effects on each other. And you made me smile with do we go out to set these kinds of so-called working class areas? Well, it made me think. I grew up in the East End of London, and Stratford was an area that you wouldn't wander into when I was growing up. it is now one of the most expensive areas to live in
True.
after the Olympic Games. And I look back and think, God, if only I'd invested then, you know. So I think it's really interesting when we look at those things, we look behind the masks of those. You know, so what is it about inclusivity? What is it about those generational divides that we can learn from past generations and past history and our heritage? But it's also important to look at new innovations so we don't simply replicate what we already know. And it's too easy to say, well, every generation has had hardship. You know, every generation has suffered housing crises or kind of social care. So I think we have to kind of broaden those debates and be more reflective.
And drawing on your work here around entrepreneurship, obviously we have seen a growth of self-employment and entrepreneurship in recent years, and particularly younger people. Is that a positive? Is that a great opportunity? Or is it something young people are doing because of the lack of alternative and better jobs of other kinds? What's your take on that?
The research says actually younger people are much more entrepreneurial. So they don't do that, say, like first-generation migrants and second-generation migrants who had to do it out of economic necessity because they couldn't get jobs. Actually, young people have an entrepreneurial spirit. So they're flexible, they've got portfolio of jobs. And what they do is they're quite strategic. You know, they'll go in and work in large organisations, take the learning from that, and then say, actually, I want to do something for myself. Sometimes that's about wanting to do social good, like social enterprises, but actually sometimes it is about, if you look at what's out there in the media, in the way that Heather was talking about it in the concept of beauty, you know, you look at programmes like Dragon's Den and The Apprentice, and suddenly you can be an entrepreneur overnight, and that's very appealing. So, you know, in answer to your question, they are entrepreneurial. They want to be able to kind of explore running their own businesses, but it's not always for economic reasons.
Thank you. We might come back to some of that, I think, in questions. I want to bring Amanda in here and think about the political dimension to this, because Neil says we shouldn't blame the baby boomers and pensioners, and I totally agree with that personally. But there is an argument put forward that older people are more likely to vote, and they're more likely to vote for parties which support their interests, and younger people are less likely to vote, and this is sometimes put forward as a reason why there is this divide. So Amanda, from your point of view and the work of the council, are young people engaging enough in politics? Can we do more to get them to engage more? What's going on in terms of political participation in younger people?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things there. And I think that's one thing, I in particular, but also BYC have always pushed back on, which is the idea that being engaged in politics simply means voting. And yes, it's very important. I think probably most people in this room would agree it is very important. But it would be wrong to suggest that I think that young people aren't political just because they don't vote. You have, people, hundreds of thousands of young people signing petitions, for example, on issues they really care about every day that maybe actually different generations, for all different reasons, aren't interested in or even haven't heard of. So there's a bit of a mixture of things there, because also there's always the question around the education system and how that complements the idea of political responsibility when you are voting. And the one thing that's always run alongside the Votes at 16 campaign has been the Education for Life, and that's actually preparing you for those things that you should want to do because it's kind of like your right to do it, and that includes voting. But one of the really interesting things that came out of the Youth Select Committee was that when the Youth Select Committee looked into Votes at 16, was that yes, traditionally there is less young people from 18 to 30 voting compared to 60 upwards, but that doesn't mean they're actually less interested. Sometimes it comes from things like less confidence in the subject, and if you're not educated in it, then actually why would you take it upon yourself to have an opinion on it? You're kind of programmed when you're younger, if you don't know something, to listen and learn, not to actually always engage or to ask questions rather than do something. So that was always something that I found quite interesting. I think if you look at the way that people are when they're younger, the way that they're working with their friends and the way that they're working in schools now, it's not the same as like traditional putting an X in a box next to something you agree with. It is using things like social media and different types of conversation and different styles of debate. And I think it can be really easy to say, oh, young people don't vote, so they don't care about politics. And if you look at the Scottish referendum, like 16 and 17-year-olds could vote there, and they turned out in their masses, and then afterwards said they'd vote again. So it's about how do you get them to, yes, understand the importance of it, but also how do we as society look at other ways they're talking about the same issues and take that with the same weight as other kind of democratic traditional practices.
And how is the campaign going to reduce the voting age to 16?
Well, I mean, obviously it's not passed, but I mean, there's more and more MPs kind of standing up and going for it like every time, and the gap in terms of when it does get debated and voted on in Parliament, the gap is really closing. So I think it's now become more of a question of when is it going to pass rather than if it's going to pass. We've just seen in Wales, the Assembly's passed to bring it in for like local elections, and the response from schools and colleges and the pupils in those schools and colleges was overwhelmingly positive, and the youth parliament that's being set up in Wales is really engaged in the process. So it does to myself, and definitely I think to a lot of our young people who have really been involved in the campaign for 3 to 5 kind of years now, it does now feel like a when is it going to pass rather than a if it's going to pass.
Let's have a quick poll here then. I think hands up, who's in favour of reducing the voting age at general elections to 16? Anyone opposed? Okay, so there are a few. So maybe later on we can find out.
Dinosaur at the end.
We'll leave that one for later, I think, and have a bit more of a debate about that, and maybe put some people on the spot as to why they oppose it, seeing you're in the minority. But that'd be good. Okay, we've talked a lot about the economic pressures on younger people, and to some extent on older people, I suppose, as well. But particularly around younger people, there are lots of other pressures on people and younger people particularly, and this is where Heather's work I think is really interesting, the pressures on us in relation to image and our bodies and so on, and how that's changing. And Heather, you said earlier it's not necessarily that it's increasing, it's just the nature of the pressures are changing. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for sure the pressures are increasing, but they're increasing across generations. So undoubtedly the demands are rising, and there's some of that's very positive. We have a much more democratic society. You know, everybody's expected to live up to some body image now in a way that was historically not the case. So previously it was only ever a small part of a society, and usually only the young. Increasingly now that's not the case. You're not supposed to age. You're all supposed to be gold, not old, to use the language of the adverts, which is just fascinating. So it's very mixed, and some of it's positive and some of it's not. But overall, you do see a rising demands, and there are some particularly worrying trends. So we now have what we think of really as an epidemic of body image anxiety. So often I get invited and say, oh, beauty, that's just, this is trivial stuff. My work comes out of being a professor of global ethics. I'm worried about justice concerns. And if you look at just how important attaining what we think of as good enough, normal, minimal standards has become, you begin to realise that those rising demands are putting pressures across the board. So just let me give you a couple of examples. I mentioned body hair earlier. So I think the changes in body hair removal across generations and very quickly are a kind of canary in the mind of very many of these beauty practices. So you see things that were once regarded as beauty practices very quickly recast as hygiene practices. Once you have something that's global, and it suddenly becomes something that you have to do to be normal, then it becomes something that becomes invisible, it's no longer a beauty practice, and suddenly you've got this rising demand. Now, some of this is driven by the industry. It's certainly the case. So the example I use with students is, Elizabeth I might want it to be young and smooth-skinned, but there wasn't a lot she could do except slap white lead on her face, which probably didn't help her beauty overall, and then make big ruffs popular to hide her aging neck and jowls. Whereas now the list of what we can do is extraordinary. As soon as we start doing it, then we gradually feel we should, and as everybody does it, then gradually that becomes normal. And that's true across the board. I'll just say one other thing about this, and it's not just a rich white Western problem. That's again just another myth. If you go and look at the poorest places in the world, you will find people swapping their antiretrovirals for skin lightening cream. Right, so if you go away with one thought from anything that I've said, because in a way it's a slight outlier, but this is becoming so predominant in how people think about themselves, in how successful they think they are, in how they judge themselves. It's very much becoming defining of the self. So if you look at things like New Year's resolutions, the top 3 of those about being a better self are nearly always about the body. That is completely different from what we used to think. We used to think that improving yourself was improving your character. Now we think it's improving your body. So we need to stop thinking of this as some individual fluffy thing and start thinking of this as a serious social problem that, as Karen says, falls differently on different generations, but it falls on all generations and irrespective more than it did.
Thanks, Heather. I know you're a philosopher, I'm a social policy academic, so I'm always trying to think about what do we do, how do we change it? So I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
I do. As Karen says, I am a philosopher, so I spend a lot longer diagnosing the problem and talking about how it changes our concept of the self than I do about thinking about how to change it. But I do think there are ways that we can change it. I think the first way we can change it is start recognising it for what it is, and the bit I bring to the table is that it really is something that's dominant, it's demanding, and I argue it's become a value framework. It's what we value most, and that means it's something that's already political, and we need to address it as a political communal topic. So naming it, I think, isn't unimportant. And then there's all kinds of different interventions. So one thing that we could do, so I was quoted in the Irish Times as Professor of Philosophy suggests fly painting pictures of normal breasts on bus stops, which I did, but not quite as it came out in the interview. So there is something about changing the diet of what we see. So the large pause is a really good example, right? You can only worry about large pause if you're, and this comes to some of the David stuff about technology, if you're already in that technical gaze. Right? If you look at another human being's face, you do not see large pause. It's a product of that technology, it's a product of HD television, and it's a product of selfies. So we can start by changing some of these diets. Social media was talked about as being profoundly important. We haven't explored how to use, or we have in some ways, but not nearly as much as we can explored how to use social media to change the diet of what we see. You see a lot of young people and older people using social media very actively around body image. I think perhaps not nearly as much as they could do and not nearly diverse and inclusively as they could do. But those are some very, very obvious ways that we could start doing campaigns.
Great, thank you. And that does lead very nicely into David's work. And I want to ask a bit more about the role of social media and technology in relation to relationships, actually, between generations, between people within generations. And does it mean that we are more isolated as individuals, social media, or does it actually bring people together more? What's your kind of take on that?
I used to think that it brings people, it can only help but bring people together. I can connect with friends of mine that I left behind in my undergraduate or my school years who live in Germany and Sweden and wherever in the world. And it can only help me keep in touch and maintain that relationship. I've started coming more along the lines of actually there's an increase in isolation in that as well, because thank you, because you have this sort of almost like a to-do list, really. You maintain your relationship and go, okay, I've talked to them now, I don't need to worry about that for a few weeks, and almost put yourself in isolation by saying, I've kind of spoken to them, I haven't caught up with them for a while, I better do that. And it comes almost like a chore or a process rather than a catching up with your friends or meeting and bumping into them or something like that you might do in the high street. So there is an element where, yes, you can be more connected and you can get whatever information you like as quickly as you like and wherever you like. I mean, I could get it off my watch sat here sort of thing, But it's simultaneously, there are some consequences where I don't think social morality has caught up with what the technology can do. And even sometimes I don't think the law has caught up in what technology can do. And there's plenty of dark cases we can look at, but we won't for tonight. But there has to be something where we stop. As an individual, if I wish to take a selfie outside a Tower Bridge or whatever, I'll take a selfie outside Tower Bridge. But I need to stop and think, as a collective, what is my role in making that carry on, and making that continually developing that selfie, so then other people see it. They think it normalises the process. And I kind of relate it back, an easy one to relate to is sort of, if you're driving home, it's a 50-mile-an-hour limit. And you've got the will and you've got the freedom to do what you like. You can drive at 60 if you like. But there should be a point where you step back and go, the collective, actually, There's more damage to be done by breaking the speed limit, perhaps crashing into somebody. You may be okay, but what if you hit someone on the side of the road faster? It's that idea of this social and antisocial behaviour that we don't always think about beyond our individual self when we're actually doing the thing we're doing. So when I relate that back to these technologies, we can do that, and if we want to, we should be allowed to, should have the freedom to do that. But I think we need to think more broadly. Does that mean that everybody then starts painting this really rosy picture, akin with the beauty industry sort of thing, that everyone else then has to live up to, or could actually be upset by at the same time? If we've got people constantly posting happy pictures of this rose-tinted view of their life on social media, that could be inducive to problems in terms of comparing yourself with that image. And if you don't live up, it can cause you some issues in your own self again. So it's that individual process of not thinking about the wider collective inadvertently comes back to get you anyway. So we should probably start thinking about it.
And is there an impact differently on different generations here, do you think? Or does it affect, as Heather says in relation to beauty, it affects all of us?
I'm going to say it affects all of us, because I've never been one to say that old people don't use the internet. You know, partly because you kind of now have to, if you want to look up your utility bill and not be charged extra for papered statements and sometimes just under the guise of CSR. You know, we're trying to save the planet, and actually what they're trying to do is cut costs. So there's that hypocrisy that's going on. I'm not suggesting we all start printing things out and everything, but that idea that actually older people can't do this. I remember about 2008, 2009, there was a Twitter user called Ivy Bean. She's the oldest Twitter user in the world. She's about 100, I think she was 104. I might have messed that age up, but she was over 100 and still using Twitter and engaging with younger generations. So again, that's where social media has this power to connect across these generations, but still within generations, you get younger people who are less enfranchised, or less, well, that's not the right word, less willing to take part in social media. And you get older generations who are. So it's difficult to put a blanket thing down, but the statistics do show us as well that, for example, Twitter has a younger audience. So there's got to be something to that of what you grew up with being normal.
When you say younger, I wonder how, I kind of think the very younger is turning away from Twitter from what I'd heard, but...
yes.
Yeah.
I like to think it's under 35.
Well, yeah, what's young is relative, isn't it? Kieran, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to pick up on some of the points that you've just raised, because I think it's really important, you know, because in some ways it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? If you look at sort of the generational divide, it's opened up access for older people and for people who are isolated and at home. So it opens the outside world in. And then I look at what happens, whether it's in the classroom or between my nephew and niece or young people, you know, in restaurants. It actually stifles this notion of relationships and building relationships. You know, when you sit and observe, everybody is on their phone in a restaurant. You know, so in some ways there's an upside, which is really, really important about reducing social isolation. And yet there's a downside. I wonder what we lose in that generational divide in terms of relationships and how you nurture relationships and how you engage in those conversations. So something gets lost in that innovation, something gets lost in that creativity.
Heather.
I just wanted to pick up on David's point about, does it make us feel bad when we're comparing to happy Facebook pages or Instagram feeds? And the psychologists tell us that yes, it does. You know, that you know, we have gone from where we would compare ourselves to the people in our village or or in our school, where we, you know, we're human beings ranked, to suddenly we can be ranked with absolutely anybody, and that's where so that happens across generations. But obviously it happens because we're now in a virtual culture and we haven't moved, as you know, as Kieran was just saying. There's an opportunity cost anytime you engage in that way. You are not engaging in something else, you know, and we haven't really caught up with what that means. And if you look, so it's certainly the case that the more you are in selfie culture, then the more demanding this will be. So if you look at the art of taking a selfie, and I don't have the figures on me, I thought maybe I had them in my stats, but I don't. But if you look at the billions of photographs that are uploaded every hour, and very many of those are of the face and the body. They're not all. Increasingly, they seem to be about food. There's a little food trend, but most of them are the face and the body. Now, to take a good selfie, this is an art in itself. You have to make up in the right way. If you start looking at the younger generation, your waitresses, you'll often see a gold nose. So there's a difference. You won't see anybody over, I don't think, 16 or 17 who's got a gold nose. But that's because you make up for selfie. You make up for a selfie, not to be seen in the real world. You then take it at the right angle, in the right way. You then use the right apps. You then use the right filters. You then post it, and then you wait for likes. And if you don't get enough likes, you take it down again. Right? And this can be a sort of competitive and sort of communal and sometimes social, but it can also be incredibly destroying and destructive. So we know that nobody's Instagram site is themselves, right? We know people put up their best selves on Facebook, right? We know that none of this is true, but that doesn't actually do anything into how those images feed into us. It's not that we're dupes or dopes or any, it's just that the nature of how we construct ourselves, it changes nothing to know that. And in fact, the most recent evidence shows that when you label images to say these have been doctored, which various Australian and French magazines have been done, in fact, that makes us feel even worse because we seem to pay more attention to those body parts. And even though we know they've been doctored, we can't not feel bad about our own legs, arms, breasts measuring up. So we haven't caught up with the changing tech in a really serious way, and we certainly haven't thought about the opportunity cost of what are we not doing if we're doing this.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Neil and then David, and anybody else in the panel who wants to make a comment on this. And then we're going to throw it over to the audience for questions, and audience online. If you're sending questions in, I'll check the laptop and see if we have some. So, Neil, if you'd like
It's just a broader point, really, from what David was saying. We've found inside the organisation, 1 million members we have, okay? So it's a large group of people. And when people retire from work at the moment, they're very conversant with email, websites, Facebook, of course. Our older members who are in their 80s and beyond, they're not on Facebook, let's be frank. Yes, of course, you've got some people, but the vast majority are certainly not. They might be on email, okay? But what we've found, and this may be the case in the future, what's acceptable when you retire, whatever that age will be, 20 years later, you might want to live your life slightly differently. And this assumption that I think is made that what you do at 50 or 60 is what you're always going to do, that actually isn't true. Our evidence internally, if you like, shows that people who were very active when they retired, online and all the rest of it, when they get to their 80s, it seems to be, I know it's very anecdotal, but when they get to their 80s, they say, actually, I can't be bothered with that anymore. Will you ring me up instead? And that's not, I'm not saying that in a nasty way. Yeah. It's not a pejorative sense. I'm saying that actually people are sort of living their lives differently. So just because you're on Facebook at 60, you might not be at 80, actually. Or whatever replaces Facebook when you get to it, And I think we just have to bear that in mind, that this is not a sort of continuum. I think there's, we have to recognise that people do change their habits.
David, you wanted to add
Yes, I was going to pick up on that actually, in terms of if you were, it doesn't necessarily mean you are going to be in the future. Although I study and investigate behaviour in online platforms, I myself don't have a Facebook account, not other than the one I use for research, but I don't have a Facebook account. I've got rid of my Instagram and Twitter apps and things because something happened where I just went, I just don't care what you think or what you're doing. Anyone, the whole world, I'm not interested, I'm sorry. And that happened to me. It got to a point. And I probably would fit the criteria of somebody who should be using it or would be on it a lot. So I find that, in complete agreement. It doesn't, there can be something that sort of triggers and you end up going, no, not for me anymore. But what I wanted to actually talk about before that was a little bit you talked a little bit about how this hasn't. There's some things that are similar in that we would look towards comparing ourselves with people in the village rather than now necessarily globally with a set of group of friends online. And I also think about when we were talking about voting and age of voting and the turnout at voting. And I'm wondering if there's a bit where things haven't changed in that we will always compare ourselves with some sort of socialised norm in some way, shape or form. So actually what has technology done is it just moved where that norm is. So I kind of want to open that up. Does that mean that this is necessarily different? on a fundamental level, yes, it's different in that it's a selfie and it's online and there are outcomes, but are we now actually measuring those things where we wouldn't have done before? And then similarly with the voting, I started to think we're at a point in time where we haven't really had votes for everybody, by which I mean men and women of, I'm going to go 18 and above, but all adults, men and women, no matter where you've come from, whether you're in Parliament or not, or whether you've got money or not, whether you're a landowner or not. And we also haven't had a time where that's been the case, and there hasn't just been a great big world war where the idea is that the phrase comes out, well, you've got to vote because it's what your dad fought for as a right. Is there a disconnect now as with a younger generation who was, that's my great-granddad? So actually that's history, and now I kind of do what I want to if I want to vote. And not voting doesn't mean not engaged. It could be, that's my signal to you that I'm not interested in any of you.
I have an answer,
parties.
but I'll let you go first, Amanda.
Well, I guess whenever we're talking about the voting, I think that was quite an interesting point, and it is one that we've spoken about quite a bit. I think my thing about voting is it's a problem that's not restricted to younger generations. People not voting, it's just more acute in younger generations. But I mean, whilst the official stats, etc., aren't exactly out, you only really have to look, not in Britain, but over in America at the midterms, and some of the exit polls that were coming out for certain places for the early voting, which does tend to be younger people, was kind of plus 500% to what you had 2 years ago in certain states. And I think actually, I think it is a really interesting point, but I always come back to the fact that actually it's a restricted, I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's more acute problem in younger people, but it's not a problem that is restricted to younger people. You don't have 100% turnout for over 60s, but you don't have national campaigns, really, to get over 60s voting, because policymakers probably are more aware that actually if they make their policy relevant to those people who are statistically more likely to vote, then they're still statistically more likely to vote. And you end up in a bit of a circle. So, I don't know, I go round and round quite a lot on it a bit in terms of where the responsibility for making people vote lies, really.
Can I bring Laura in? I think you wanted to.
I've sort of apologised because I wanted to respond to a couple of the points Neil made, which is dragging the conversation away from where we've been really interestingly and back to living standards, which is obviously my obsession. I think you made a really important point, Neil, that this is not older generation's fault, and if I implied that in what I was saying, that's absolutely not the conclusion of this research. I think there's a variety of structural policy decisions, demographic trends, the challenges of dealing with a very large generation, stuff that's come out of some of the voting patterns we've talked about, and all sort that have caused the challenges I've made for younger generations. So I really agree with the idea it's not older generation's fault, and that's why the solutions we've come up with are not about some parts of policy are zero sum. If we're going to pay for the welfare state in future, which is going to need more money, we have to tax someone. And so there are decisions that are zero-sum and you need to think about what's fair. But lots of others aren't, like how we make structural reforms in the labour market and how we de-risk pensions. So saying that younger generation are facing challenges is not about blaming older generations. You also said, you mentioned a couple of things, like it was really the interest rates experienced in the 70s and 80s and the high unemployment were just as bad. And I think sometimes those hands get overplayed. Although unemployment didn't go as much up as much overall in this recession, it was way more skewed towards the young. And the high interest rates on mortgages were obviously a real problem, but they were correlated with very high inflation and high house prices. So what they did is they really quickly eroded the value of your debt. It inflated the value of your assets. So I think we need to be a little bit careful there as throwing those as kind of... and then finally you said that don't forget that half of pensioners have incomes lower than 12k, and you might be talking about private incomes, but one of the big findings from our research is that typical pensioner household incomes after housing costs are now higher than typical working age incomes. And that's a huge shift over 20 years. So I absolutely agree we need to be focused on the fact that there are still far too many poor pensioners, even though pensioner poverty has fallen by a third. But we're now in a situation where the median, the typical income is higher if you're a pensioner than if you're working age. And that's a really big shift in society. And I think that really exemplifies some of the problems I'm talking about in terms of what generations in younger working age and early parenthood are facing.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go and join the panel in a minute, and right now actually, and check my laptop. So it's over to you for questions. We've got a mic, and we do need to use the mic for questions because we want to catch it for people watching live or who will tune in later on YouTube. So let me go and get my space, and then be ready with your questions, I hope.
While you're sitting down, Karen, can I just answer David's question of is it different?
Yes,
Very
please.
quickly. Yes, it's different. It's fundamentally different because we've never had a global ideal before, and only in a global ideal can you get the normalising I was talking about, that shifting from a beauty practice to a hygiene practice. That cannot happen if you have different local ideals. So the answer is yes, fundamentally different. So all that, oh, it's historical, we've always had beauty standards. No, we haven't like this. So.
Okay, good. We've got lots to debate because we talked about economic pressures. There's a bit of a debate going on there about political participation, new technology, body image. Change the time. I've got one hand very high up in the air. So over to you. And then Mike is just coming. And please, others, do have your questions ready.
Right. My name is Keith Coggins. I'm a member of the West Midland Pensioners Convention, the NPC, and I work for a charity. Now, the charity that I work for is mainly for homeless and low poverty area people who are mainly under 35. And I have never come across anybody in that organisation. I've been working with them now since 1997. I have never come across an individual there that has accused me of being better off and the reason for the problem that they're suffering from. There is no doubt about it. This is a media trick, this generational divide. And if you look at it, you talk to your family. And I bet there isn't anybody in your family who think that you have caused, if they're unemployed or anything, you are the reason for the cause, if you're over 50. Yeah, I mean, it's all down to, if we were living in America, Trump would be up there telling us it's all fake news. But in actual fact, it isn't. It's a situation where there has been contrived. It's been contrived by both the government and the media. The media are the biggest influence in this thing. They are the people that report the stuff that the government want to set that generational thing. I don't know whether you remember when Frank Field was in charge of the simplification of income tax, and he came forward with the idea that all pensioners should pay national insurance contributions. That was kicked into touch, not by the pensioners, although the pensioners' organisations did have a lot of influence, but the youngsters were the ones that came out on the streets with us, and they were the ones that put it away. You've not heard anything more about it, have you? It's gone. It's completely gone. And when you talk about voting, that the youngsters don't vote, what you've got to remember is a lot of those youngsters that are able to vote at 18, they're away from home. They're in universities and places like that. They're not able to vote. You had the same situation in 1958 when the Labor government at that time were complaining about the youngsters never voted, and a survey was taken, and what did they find out? The majority of 18 to 25-year-olds were doing national service, and so they weren't voting. They were all over the world. And this is the sort of thing that this fake media and fake news is constantly doing. And if you are educating our youngsters, and you are falling for the same trap. You've got a notice up there, look, can we overcome there's no such thing as a generational divide. If you're honest, it's like the King's New Clothes. Remember Hans Christian Andersen? The King's New Clothes? Everybody was saying, oh, they're wonderful. There was the poor old king walking about naked. So, it's a con trick again.
Thank you very much for that. We did pose the question and deliberately in a provocative way, so it obviously worked. And it's really good to have this debate. So I think maybe Laura might want to come back, and I don't know if Amanda wants to, and we can have
I'll be really quick because I think this is just following on from what I said a couple of minutes ago. I agree. Generational blaming is divisive and wrong, and we should be doing everything we can to stop that, because actually so much of our research shows the solidarity between different generations in families. I think families are coping with generational challenges, and one of our arguments is it's time for the state to step up in the same way. So I really agree with you, Keith, that I've challenged the words like war and divide. I don't think there's a generational divide in society. I do think there is evidence of a generational living standards challenge, and I think we need to keep those two things separate. So keep the blame out of the analysis of the economic data and the analysis of the right policy solutions. So thank you for keeping us all in check on that front.
Amanda, did you want to?
Yeah, so just on like a really specific point, and to be fair, I actually don't know when it came in, so I've kind of maybe not a great answer, but students can be registered both at their home address and at their university address. But I think actually the problem is that, one, you're not told that when you start university, unless normally your student union is like quite proactive in doing a campaign around voter registration with the local council, local authority, whoever it happens to be. But also, two, like the idea of voter registration only really comes into effect when there's something to vote on. Like you don't have as big a voter registration or information drives. You know, maybe a bad example now, but like this year, whenever we next go to have a general election or vote or whatever, you'll see huge voter registration drives, and there'll be a lot of information saying students, you can, you know, vote in one place, but be registered in both places. But I really should know, but I don't actually know when that came in, so it might have changed relatively kind of recently.
And I want to pick up on that point. I loved your passion, Keith, and that kind of real commitment, and I think that's really important. But raising questions like, is there a generation divide, is really quite critical. And I want to pick up the thing about what you said about voting, because I think it's really important. But this notion of mobilisation, you said when it really mattered, actually, people worked together to affect that change. So I do wonder if it's about young people not taking the opportunity. It feels too easy to say it's because they're at university. What about that massive group who don't have that privilege of going to university? You know, do they choose not to vote? I think we might want to kind of think about, going to the points that you were raising, David, their view of going to vote, giving up a day or an evening to go to a local school or a village hall, to go and tick a box, is not the way that they operate. That's not, you know, we've seen that from what other panellists have said. So if we want to engage young people to take up their right to vote, they have to feel passionate and committed about the agenda, and those agendas have to speak to them, just like yours has just done. But then the processes of voting have also got to be fit for purpose and engage new spaces and new voices. So, you know, I think those things are kind of really important. And the third point I'd want to make about, you know, the generational divide, it's a great way of starting a kind of a conversation about looking back at our history and our heritage, but also as a way of informing as we create new history and new heritage. And for me, it's how those two encounters come together, where they collide both positively, but also through a richness of learning that says the next generation do not want to live the lives of the generation before them. And I talk about that in the context of, you know, workplaces. So some of the research that I do is people say to me, so are young people going to make the kind of leaders that we have now? And the answer is no, because workplaces won't look like what they look like now. So we're asking the wrong questions. You know, they have aspirations to take up leadership roles, but they also want work-life balance. And if you look at sort of our generation, or, you know, my generation or my parents' generation, they also had aspirations. So it's what's happening in the economic world, what's happening in the social world, what's happening in the cultural world that often, you know, help drive what future generations do and the choices they make, whether it's in housing, in social care, in voting, workplaces or education. And I think we have to find a way of looking at all of those things in a much more holistic way.
Thanks, Kira.
Can I just come back on
Yeah,
that?
sure.
So when you mentioned the idea of them wanting to set the agenda, so every year BOIC essentially runs like a national consultation, and it's called Make Your Mark. And this is the first year that over 1 million young people, 11 to 18, filled it out. And we said earlier, 1 million is a large number, and kind of agree. And actually, when the whole reason I think that so many of them are so engaged in that conversation, it's done through schools, through libraries, quite like traditional places where, you know, everybody says, oh, young people don't like going or don't hang out or whatever. But actually they were allowed to set the agenda, and then they got to prioritise the agenda, and then you end up with what they want to debate, what they want to talk about, and what they want the council to prioritise for the year. And the top 5 issues that came out a couple of weeks ago was knife crime, mental health, equal pay for equal work, tackling homelessness, and votes at 16. And those aren't necessarily, I think, 5 issues that a lot of people would have said, oh, 11 to 18-year-olds in this country, a million of them really want to tackle equal pay for equal work. But, you know, it's something that came out as third, and quite a significant third, in the ballot. So I think there's something to be said around them setting the agenda, and if politicians aren't reflecting that agenda, like obviously it's quite hard to engage people like, oh, but if you go and vote, that politician might never represent you. They might never have the same agenda as you, but you should still go and vote, like in that local thing once every 5 years or so. So you're right about the idea of allowing young people to set the agenda.
And it was body image not very long ago.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Neil, I think you wanted
2
to
very
come in.
quick points. Keith makes a really good point in passing, which is the fact that huge numbers of voluntary organisations in our country rely on older people and the contribution that they make. And in 2010, Cardiff University did a study called Gold Age Pensioners, where they quantified the amount that pensioners put into the economy over and above what they draw out in pensions, bus passes, care and so on. And they did that in 3 ways. Taxation of some form, direct taxation for those who were still paying tax, but indirect taxation for everybody else, volunteering, and of course unpaid caring. And when you calculated all that together, at that time, Cardiff said by now we'd be looking at a net contribution of £70 billion every year that older people are putting into the economy in those various ways. So they're an asset, and that has to be recognised in that sense. Second point is about voting. It's quite ironic, I think, that in the last election, most older people, or more older people, voted for the Conservatives than for other parties. Not always been the case. In 1997, when Blair got in, most older people voted for Labour. But the last election, that wasn't true. Yet the last election, you had a Conservative manifesto that was quite anti-pensioner in many respects compared to some of the other manifestos that were on the block, okay? So if it might turn out that actually pensioners are not that savvy when it comes to voting, because a large number of them voted for the Tories, yet the Tories were going to means test the winter fuel allowance, they were going to introduce more draconian measures on social care and so on. Yet they still, by and large, voted for those policies. Now they're either being really altruistic, or they're stuck in their ways, or there's some other reason that's going on. So this idea that they can be sort of wheeled out and mobilised and all the rest of it, I'm not quite sure that really works. People have often talked to me, particularly from the media, about the grey vote. I'm not sure there is a grey vote. I think that's a myth, absolutely, because that implies you can manipulate that and do with it what you want, and I don't think you can.
Okay, so we've got a really good question online around voting, and we obviously can't have an evening debate without talking about Brexit. So the question is, do you think the Brexit referendum highlights the gap between generations? Because we did see quite a difference of opinion by age in terms of Brexit. So I'm interested to hear the panel's views on that one. I don't know, Amanda, if this is something you've been involved with, isn't it?
So what was the question? How was it phrased?
Do you think the Brexit referendum highlights the gap between generations?
I think it maybe highlights the difference in opinions of a means to an end, because I don't believe that anybody voted to make other people unhappy or to create like bad discourse within families or any of that kind of stuff, or to make people feel less international or globalist or anything. I think actually people have just different definitions of essentially trying to get to the same thing. A lot of people went to that referendum because they wanted to make their lives and their families' lives and their friends better, but tradition, you know, it's kind of proven that the younger generations thought that was done by voting one way, and older generations thought it was done by voting another way. And I don't know, I always find that quite a difficult one, because I think it's kind of putting the onus more on what people wanted to achieve, or like how they wanted to achieve it maybe, but actually I think everybody kind of wanted the same outcome, like overall there was just two different ways of like getting it.
Anybody else on the panel have a view on the Brexit referendum? And
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't deny that more older people voted to leave than remain. But if you look at some of the breakdown, people who were didn't have university educations were more likely to vote to leave. White people were more likely to vote to leave. People on lower incomes were more likely to vote to leave. So when the differences are posed in terms of just age, that's when it becomes a problem. When you say, actually, there's a whole number of factors as to why people voted a certain way. How well educated were they? Where did they live? What ethnicity did they come from? It's a much more complex than a binary sort of old-young debate, although we have to accept that age was one of those crucial factors.
Okay, I will come to the audience in a minute, but I have to say I've got some fantastic questions. And there's Andy in New York, apparently, because you can't really tell on technology, can you? You could be anywhere, Andy. Could be anybody. But if you are out there in New York, thanks for joining us. And your question is, how can we create safe spaces where different generations can discuss and solve challenges? And I think it's a great question. Anybody on the panel, or actually in the audience, if anybody here, because we've got National Pensioners Convention, I presume you're mostly pensioners who get together, we've got British Youth Council, I presume you're mostly young people. Do we speak to each other across the generations in different places? We see on TV the idea of this, you know, the childcare nursery with older people, that great initiative. Do we have enough safe spaces? Yeah, Laura.
I'll just be really quick. I think, I don't know about safe spaces in particular, but there is evidence that although, as we've all said, we don't believe in this concept of a generational war, generational divide, we are more divided. So where we live, we live much more in age clusters than we did 20 years ago. The age of your area is much more segregated in terms of there are places where old people live and places where young people live than 20 years ago. So we live in a more generationally divided way, and our workplaces are more generationally divided too. There's some evidence of that. So what drove that we can debate about, but it is the case that we are being given less opportunities to mix with people of different generations outside of our family, because we've acknowledged the family is doing a lot of work in providing generational support. And maybe that's one of the barriers to making progress on some of the tough challenges around voting, around living standards, around technology, around beauty norms and all the things the panel's discussed.
And just building on that, I wonder if it's a question of safe spaces or spaces full stop. So, you know, the power of stories, the power of narratives. You know, we have such rich culture, you know, through our theatres, through our galleries, through our open spaces. And I wonder if we use those more effectively to convey those stories. You know, I mean, recently I did a piece of work using art and looking at the history of enterprise and entrepreneurship, you know, people starting their own businesses, sort of the first generation, the second generation, the third generation. And it wasn't always about migrant families. And actually, those powerful images and those powerful stories helped one generation and a second generation. And a second piece that we recently did was through a piece of theatre where we took a real life story of husbands and wife as co-entrepreneurs with their children as part of that story, who were in the audience because they had no idea of what that would, you know, what that could kind of mean. So I think we could create new spaces that allow us to feel and experience rather than rationalise those processes. And I think then that's quite powerful. And it develops the point that you made, Keith, because that's where mobilisation comes from. That's where understanding of what a first generation has done to what a second generation does, to what a third generation learns from. So there's something that we hold on in relation to the past, but there is also something around how we move, you know, sort of forward.
Right, now's your chance. Sorry, I've kept you at bay. We'll take a lady at the back first, please.
I don't get called a lady very often, but my name's Yvonne Washbourne. I'm from the Midland TUC Pensioners Network. I was intrigued to read your report, Laura, and I must admit there's lots of in it that I disagreed with, and I asked Frances O'Grady from the Regional Secretary of TUC, hobnobbing with the famous again, and she said that although she was there, that she didn't agree with quite a lot of the the recommendations, I think, and you'll probably find that most of us older souls don't either. But the thing I wanted to say most, Neil touched on the thing about pensions and how, you know, they're not as simple as, you know, us oldies get a really decent pension and young people are going to suffer. That's too simplistic. But I think the real debate should be about rich and poor. There are millions of poor pensioners. There are millions of poor people in their 35 to 55. And also the divide in wages between the different ethnic groups in this country and women and men. Those are the things that we should be honing in on. Because that thing about medium incomes, you know, between older and younger, sometimes that clouds the issue. You know, my friend here in front, he mentioned the work he does about homeless people. There is a growing elderly homelessness problem now, where people, you know, mainly men, I have to say, break up of marriages or relationships and find themselves on the streets. In Manchester, the older generation are going to the airport to sleep, but being turfed out by the police. So I think we skew the debate by talking about generations. We should be talking about those that have got pots of money and don't share it, and those that are poor and need it. I think that's where the debate should be. Thank you.
Can I come in on that one, actually, just a little bit, and slightly to hopefully back Laura up on this too, because a lot of the recommendations, I think, from the Resolution Foundation report were about wealth and taxing wealth. So it was about taxing wealthy people. Many of those people will be older people because they have more wealth than younger people. So while that isn't the target, that generation, wealth is the target, but it will impact more on wealthy people who are more in that generation than younger people. So I think I'd hope there's quite a lot in common with your concerns and interests, and certainly mine, and I think the Resolution Foundation too, although obviously let Laura speak for herself.
No, you've done a better job than I could. I think, as I've said, the Resolution Foundation's raison d'etre is living standards for people on low income, so we're never going to lose sight of the differences between rich and poor. But increasingly, the differences between rich and poor are, or more so than in the past, the differences between rich and poor are aligned with age, which has driven the generational focus. But lots of the policy solutions, as Karen said, they're not age targeted, they're wealth targeted. So they're focusing on the same issues you raise. And I think, of course, there's space in social policy debate and definitely in policy analysis and economic analysis for more than one prism. So I don't want a conversation about generations to cloud out conversations about ethnicity, the income distribution, the wealth distribution, the differences between different genders. I don't think when we have... And I think that it's really important to add those conversations about difference between young and old to the debate, because they help us understand who is rich and who is poor in society today. So I'm not arguing for getting rid of other debates in society. I think this is an additional debate to have today that helps us understand what's going on in terms of things like income and wealth distributions.
So I've got another question on here around body image, so one for Heather particularly, and it's about, are the body image issues across generations the same for both men and women, so looking at gender aspect of this?
No, they're not. So the simple answer is no, they're not, but they're more similar than they were. So I argue that there's a global ideal for women that is actually global. It's about thinness, often with curves in various types, smoothness, firmness and youth. When it comes to men, the only thing that tracks globally is tallness, and that makes a lot of difference in terms of what you can normalise. So the normalisation that's running apace for women is not yet doing that for men. But it is the case that men are far more concerned about body image than they ever have been. And this is where there are maybe more generational divides in men than in women. So, you know, young men, nearly a third of the sufferers from eating disorders if they're very young and male. You see young men aspiring to unrealistic body ideals, particularly the pumped up version that you didn't before. So I think perhaps this is something that I think maybe the questioner is very right. There are differences between men and women, and perhaps there are more generational differences between men than there are between women.
Okay, other questions from the audience? Yeah, please, over here, if we can get...
Maybe this is more Heather and David, but you were speaking earlier about social media and this sort of negative body image that can perpetuate, and how people tend to perpetuate a sort of perfect-looking life on there as well. Is there any evidence in your research that there's a backlash to social media amongst younger people, or are we going further down this rabbit hole before we get out of it again?
Not in my research directly, but there's certainly evidence out there in research that I can talk about. We see, if we look just some of the basic statistics in terms of, I think you touched on earlier, younger people moving away from Twitter and Facebook to more private channels of direct communication. So I'm thinking more instant messenger, WhatsApp, Snapchat, and ephemeral type of activities as well, where the content disappears after a time. So there seems to be a move around in which areas are siloing different groups to an extent. There is a backlash, and there's certainly one in the press at the moment that we're seeing in terms of reactions to different social media platforms and the way in which they've been handling data, or not handling data, should I say. But then there's also been some research suggesting that actually we are engaging more in social media, if we take the definition to include pretty much anything that's interactional and fairly modern by the sounds of it. So yes, there's a backlash, but it is getting to become more widespread across platforms. But we do also have a problem of the wormhole at the same time. So one of my concerns for social media users more generally, regardless of age, is the wormhole. If I am interested in the views of, enter politician here, and I go and follow them on social media, I get more recommendations from the algorithms about similar sort of things, and I may then not have my eyes open to the other conversations, and that's to go into something, to a debate, to knowledge quite blindly. And you do start to see that a little bit in our classes as well. If something is not immediately available on Google, and therefore not come up in a feed or something, it doesn't exist. And that's dangerous, because we need to have our eyes open to other people's opinions, even if we don't want to hear them.
Yeah, so I think there are potentially positive things that we could use social media for, but I think we haven't, and I think much of the backlash is pretty poor. So, you see, so things like social media used for body positivity, this is often just like, marketing fudges to sell more stuff. If you think about what the images that those are, so if the global ideal is thinness, firmness, smoothness and youth, very many body positivity movements will change one of those vectors, but only one. So you'll get large body positivity movements, but you still get fulfilling all the other features of firmness and thinness, and that's more demanding, right? It's more demanding to be firm and big, and then you'll often get very made up, very posed, very hyper feminized, right? So that what message is that giving? It's certainly not countering the beauty ideal. Likewise, you'll get, we're doing armpits for August and we're growing body hair, and so you'll get these otherwise very beautiful women who are thin, firm and smooth, but they've just got armpit hair. What you don't get is, aging, old, wrinkly, hairy, right? There's no real backlash against that. It's all about image. It's all about the picture. The virtual culture is an image-based culture. So Twitter is not, but most of them are, and you gradually see more and more images in that way. And if you move to the most popular amongst the younger generation, which will be Instagram and Snapchat, they're wholly image-based. So I think the backlash widely looked for is pretty non-existent.
Okay, one last question for the audience, because I know he's had his hand up pretty much the whole time and I've been ignoring him. So go for it.
Yes, I'm Trevor Fisher, and Karen doesn't know who I am. My reality, I think the reality is that this is not only a generation divide, it is a massive generation divide. It has been realised by the Conservative Party for some years, and they have deliberately played on this. The last election, as colleagues just rightly said, the old voted overwhelmingly for the Conservative Party. 90% of old people voted, and they are mainly Conservative. And the age factor in that election was absolutely stark. For every single segment of the age population, Labour gained and the Conservatives lost in the lower age groups. And the higher up they went, the tipping point was 47. if you're over 47, you're more likely to vote for the Conservatives than you were for Labour. And that was true in the 2015 election as well. I haven't gone back any further than that. But what the Conservative Party did very cleverly was to play with the state pension, which was pretty much ring-fenced. I have two pensions. I'm a teacher, ex-teacher, and I'm also obviously over 65. The index linking for my state pension was maintained. For my teacher's pension, it was not. And so they've been very clever until Theresa May, who is a complete idiot, decided to do that. Now, as far as the politics are concerned, I think it will become a generation war quite quickly unless we're very, very careful because of Brexit. I mean, Brexit is, whatever you think about it, an old person's choice. And the young do not want it. But the old will die. I will die, and I've just made my pension plan. I'm not going to live to see the consequences, right or wrong, but young people are, and they do not like it. Now, yesterday, Scottish Parliament voted for a people's vote. SNP, Greens, and Liberal Democrats voted in favour. Labour and the Tories voted against. I think in Scotland, those two parties now have a major problem. And as young people come onto the scene and find they have to deal with this situation, it will start to become a very, very unpleasant situation.
Thanks very much for that. People can respond to that or to any other point, because I think this is probably about the time we need to start wrapping up. So I'm going to ask each of the panel members for a last thought or comment, either in response to what we've just heard or any other point that they wanted to make and had this opportunity live on camera and to the audience in the room. And I'm going to start with, anybody want to volunteer? Anybody? Dave?
Yeah, I'll have to. I guess my concluding comments then are really, what I've always noticed and started, we even have it ourselves, is that whenever we have these discussions around some sort of divide, some inequality, a Brexit situation, whatever it is, we can only ever at one time speak of one factor. So I've come here with a technology view, and we've got multiple across the panel, and our opinions are going to be on that because that's our bag. But this is such a complex situation. Any of these that I've just named, generational divide, whatever, it's so complex that it's going to be really difficult to unpick. And when we start to do it, we have to focus on one or two things first. We can't do it all at once. And so I think one of the things to take away is actually, if we're going to pick on something, what do we pick on to start with? Where do we go?
Okay, leave that.
I don't have an answer.
Thanks. Well, that's what academics do. They ask questions they don't always answer.
Yeah, exactly.
Heather.
Okay, so I'm going to just end with a personal comment in that every day I rely on intergenerational solidarity to do my job. I am here tonight because my mother has picked my daughter up and taken her swimming, right? And I know families do this well, but as a woman trying to do this job, which demands evening work, intergenerational, utter solidarity, I could not do 1 week of my job without my mother. And not everybody has that, and this is where Laura's point about making sure that these are political state policies, so that people who are not lucky enough to have an amazing mother as I have the ability to do different kinds of jobs and roles.
Okay. Laura.
I was going to conclude with something really similar on
Glad I got to go first.
different kinds of inequality, and we should be concerned about all of them. So I mentioned this at the start in passing, but I think if you're coming from a standard, a sort of traditional rich and poor view, then one of the reasons why you might be concerned about generational differences in living standards and particularly wealth is our research has looked at the wealth that is increasingly concentrated in older populations and looked at who the children of those people are. Tend to be the ones already with the homes, already with the better jobs. So if we don't think about that concentration of wealth and what it might be used for in terms of funding the welfare state, we're heading for a situation in which that gets passed down and drives wider social inequalities in future. So I think there's a symbiosis between inter and intra-generational inequalities, which is why the Resolution Foundation has been focusing on both.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Kieran next and then come this way.
So I guess I want to leave on a slightly different note to what we've heard. I guess if we continue to talk about diversity and equality and inclusivity from a deficit model, we will never change the conversation. We'll be having this conversation next year, the year after, and the year after that. And so I'd like to move from talk to action and almost unravel, but in a much more interdisciplinary way, how we work as a collective. So what would a collective society look like around inclusivity? And actually not keep pushing the responsibility on everybody else, but look at what role do we play in perpetuating social inequality? What role do we play? And by the we, I mean the I, and I include myself in that, because only then will we shift the dial and shift the conversation and move to action.
Thank you. Neil?
I think the debate about generational unfairness is valid and up to a point. The problem with it is that it tends to crowd out a much bigger and more important issue, which is about class, income, and real massive inequality in our society. 5 families owning the equivalent wealth of the bottom 12.6 million people in this country. That's where reports, think tanks, politicians need to be looking. And my fear is that while we're arguing over the crumbs between young and old, somebody else has already eaten the cake and taken it. And we're taking our eye off that debate if we get sucked into well, we've got to take away a bus pass here and tinker there. We've got to talk about our taxation system being much fairer, including wealth taxes, of course, absolutely. But let's not see it in age terms. I agree with Laura on that. Let's not see it in age terms. Let's see it in terms of wealth. And by that, I also mean young people who are wealthy as well. And by young people, I don't mean people who are 21. I mean people who are 40 and 30 and 50 and so on. So the fact that this recent government has, allowed people, the budget last week, I have got to catch a train, but I just want to make this point. The budget last week, if you were earning over £100,000, you were £600 better off at the end of the budget statement than you were at the beginning. If you had a very modest income of about £20,000, you were only about £200 better off. And that just goes by. And that's where the debate's got to be.
Thank you. Amanda?
So I guess I'll finish by... thank you. No, I'll finish by actually coming back to your last question, kind of point there about Brexit. And actually, I honestly just kind of completely agree with, I think that if the conversation isn't had across generations, across class, across geography, city, rural, like whatever, then actually Brexit will continue to dominate the national conversation. But a lot of people will continue to only look at the age factor, which was definitely a factor, but it wasn't the only factor. But I actually agree with you, and I guess if there was one point to finish on, people should really reach out to someone who voted differently to them, regardless of age. Yeah. Maybe not quite on topic, but still.
I think we've had a really good debate, actually, a difference of opinions, but actually probably more in common with each other than the differences that we may have aired. We've looked at so many different topics, and I think that's been really interesting and unusual, actually, when we have discussions. We often focus just on the economics or the politics or technology or other things. So trying to bring all that together has been really, really interesting. We've had some fantastic questions from people here and online. I want to say a huge thank you to Chelsea Wood over there, who put so much effort into organising this debate and brought this fantastic panel together with colleagues from marketing communications as well. So last of all, thank you. I'd like to really thank the panel for coming and giving us a really interesting evening. So thanks very much to everybody, and I hope we can keep this debate going. Thanks. Thank you.